Amid the luxury of a life built on dark secrets, a tech tycoon sees his world turned upside down when he crosses paths with two teenage siblings with a past marked by pain and a devastating message: "It's your fault." The encounter triggers a spiral of mystery, betrayal, and redemption, forcing the businessman to confront the ghosts of his choices while struggling to protect the young ones and repair the mistakes of a tainted legacy. In a journey filled with thrilling twists, this story reveals that even the most powerful cannot escape the consequences of their actions, and that true transformation is born from facing the past. The sun was setting over Chicago when Richard Thompson stepped out of his armored Land Rover in front of the old St. George building in the city center. At 55, the CEO of Thompson Technologies bore on his face the marks of someone who had spent the last 5 years immersed in work and isolation. His impeccable Italian suit contrasted with the peeling facade of the building, which would soon give way to another of his company's ventures. "We need to check the structure before starting." "The demolition, sir," explained the engineer accompanying him, consulting a digital clipboard. "Some residents still haven't accepted the relocation offer." Richard adjusted his discreetly framed glasses and observed the building with a mix of impatience and fascination. It was hard to believe that this decaying place occupied land worth millions. His thoughts were interrupted by movement on the third floor, a shadow quickly passing by one of the broken windows. "I thought the building was empty at this hour," he remarked, furrowing his brow. "It should be," replied the engineer, concerned. "Should I call security?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. Something about that shadow had piqued his curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'll take a look, wait here." Ignoring the engineer's protests, Richard crossed the deteriorating lobby. The smell of mold and abandonment filled the air as his footsteps echoed through the empty hallways. On the third floor, he came across a slightly open door. Through the crack, he saw something that made him freeze. On the walls of the apartment, dozens of detailed drawings depicted his mansion in the Upper West Side. They were precise, almost photographic illustrations showing angles that only someone from inside could know. His private office, the winter garden, even the room he had kept locked since the disappearance of Eleanor, his wife. In the center of the room, a girl of about 17 was furiously scribbling in a notebook, while a younger boy, perhaps 12, watched from the window. "Who are you?" asked Richard, pushing the door open. The girl jolted awake, clutching the notebook to her chest. Her dark, deep, and defiant eyes met Richard's with a disturbing intensity. The boy ran to his sister's side, assuming a protective stance despite the evident fear on his face. How did you manage to draw these places?" Richard insisted, taking a step forward. The girl stepped back, pulling her brother by the hand. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice firm, contrasting with her fragile appearance. "It's not time yet." "Time for what? What are you talking about?" Before he could stop them, the two youngsters slipped out through a side door, leaving behind only a sheet of paper that had fallen from the notebook. Richard picked it up with trembling hands. On it was a portrait of Eleanor in her winter garden, smiling as she watered her orchids. On the back, 3 words written in elegant cursive: "It's your fault." Richard felt the world spin. That drawing had been made recently. The orchids depicted were the same ones Eleanor had cultivated before her disappearance 5 years ago. How was this possible? Who were those kids? And why did they know so much about his private life? He hurried down the stairs, ignoring the calls from the engineer waiting for him at the entrance. When he reached the street, there was no sign of the siblings. Only the noise of traffic and the city beginning to light up for the night. Richard looked again at the drawing in his hands, feeling as though he had just stumbled upon something far larger and more complex than he could imagine. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "Look for Elizabeth and Luke Smith. They have the answers you're looking for." Attached to the message was an old photo of a woman he immediately recognized, Margaret Smith, a former employee of Thompson Technologies, who had mysteriously disappeared after presenting a troubling report about the company's operations in Bloomington. That night, for the first time in years, Richard couldn't focus on work. Sitting in his office at the mansion, Surrounded by the luxury and technology he had built, he felt strangely vulnerable. The drawings, the children, the mysterious message, everything pointed to a past he had worked hard to bury. As he gazed at the city through the bulletproof windows, Richard made a decision. He would find those siblings and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did he know that this decision would forever change not only his life, but also his understanding of family, redemption, and the true meaning of responsibility. The next morning found Richard in his office at Thomson Technologies, sleep replaced by a growing obsession. On his computer screen, old company documents revealed fragments of Margaret Smith's story. Hired as an environmental analyst in 2015, she had stood out for her competence and dedication. Until 5 years ago, she presented an alarming report about the company's operations in Bloomington. "Mr. Thompson, your daughter is on the line," his secretary announced over the intercom. Richard hesitated for a moment. Amanda, his only daughter, rarely reached out to him since she had taken on the role of director at an environmental NGO, a position that often put her in direct conflict with the interests of Thomson Technologies. "Put her through, Clara." "Dad?" Amanda's voice sounded tense. "We need to talk about Bloomington." Richard felt his stomach drop. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because I just received some interesting documents. Did you know Margaret Smith had 2 children, Elizabeth and Luke? They disappeared along with her after the report was shelved." The businessman narrowed his eyes, connecting the dots. "The young people from the abandoned building. Amanda, I need you to come to my office. Now." "Impossible. I'm heading to Bloomington." "There's something happening there, Dad." "Something that was covered up a long time ago." Before Richard could respond, his daughter hung up. He cursed under his breath, remembering the piercing gaze of the girl in the abandoned building, Elizabeth. Now the name carried a much deeper meaning. That afternoon, Richard cancelled all his meetings and drove to the suburb where Margaret had lived. The small apartment was now occupied by new tenants, but the building manager still remembered the former tenant. Mrs. Margaret? How could I forget? A dedicated woman, raising her kids alone. The girl Elizabeth was a prodigy with her drawings, always quiet, observing everything. Little Luke was always glued to his sister. After she disappeared, they say the kids went to a shelter, but no one knows for sure. Richard thanked her and returned to his car, his mind racing. On the passenger seat, Eleanor's drawing seemed to stare at him with a silent question. How did his wife connect to all of this? He drove to his mansion, where he was greeted by the usual silence. In the winter garden, Eleanor's orchids were still tended to daily by the staff, exactly as she had left them. Richard walked to the locked room, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. 5 years had passed since he last entered. The room was exactly as Eleanor had left it. On the desk, a folder caught his attention. Inside it, he found something that made his heart race. A drawing by Elizabeth, signed and dated 5 years ago. It depicted the winter garden, but from an impossible angle, as if the artist had been inside the house. Richard's phone vibrated. Again. It was another message from the unknown number. "Look in Lab 7. Not all is lost." Lab 7, the old research facility of Thomson Technologies in Bloomington, decommissioned after the incident. The same place mentioned in Margaret's report. Richard picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Arthur." "It's me, Richard. I need you to unlock some old files for me about Lab 7. "Richard?" The voice of Arthur Johnson, his former partner, sounded surprised. "I thought we agreed never to bring this up again." "Things have changed. Margaret Smith's children are alive. And they know something." A long silence followed on the other end of the line. When Arthur spoke again, his voice had a different tone, almost threatening. "Don't dig into this, Richard. Some secrets need to stay buried." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard with a growing sense of unease. He looked again at Eleanor's drawing, noticing details he hadn't seen before. In the reflection of the winter garden window, the faint silhouette of a woman watching the scene could be seen. A woman who looked strikingly like Margaret Smith. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him turn sharply. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow quickly pass by the door. When he reached the hallway, He found only a new drawing on the floor. Lab 7 in flames, with a lone figure watching from afar. On the back, another message. She tried to warn you. Richard realized he was in the middle of a web of events far more complex than he had imagined. Eleanor, Margaret, the mysterious drawings, Lab 7. All the pieces were connected in some way. And somewhere in the city, two brothers held the answers he was desperately seeking. The rain fell relentlessly over Chicago as Richard returned to the St. George building. This time, there were no engineers or security guards, just him and his determination to find answers. He climbed the dark stairs guided by the light of his phone, his footsteps echoing through the empty building. The third-floor apartment was different. The drawings had disappeared from the walls, but new details caught his attention. A thin mattress in the corner, some clothes neatly folded, food wrappers. The brothers had been living there. "They won't be back today," a woman's voice sounded behind him. Richard turned quickly to find Amanda standing in the doorway, drenched by the rain. "I took them to a safe place." How did you find them?" Amanda stepped into the apartment, her eyes scanning the room with a mix of sadness and determination. "They came to me, Dad. Elizabeth reached out to the NGO 3 months ago, right after she ran away from the shelter with Luke." Richard sat down on a makeshift chair, feeling the weight of the revelations. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because they made me promise. They needed time to gather evidence." Amanda pulled an envelope from her bag. "But now things have changed. Look at this." Inside the envelope were more of Elizabeth's drawings, but these were different. They depicted scenes from the past. Margaret Smith working in Lab 7, talking to Eleanor in the winter garden, the two brothers still young playing in a park. "Elizabeth has a special gift," Amanda explained. "She can capture memories in her drawings, even ones she hasn't personally experienced. It's like she can see through the eyes of others." "That's impossible," Richard murmured, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. "As impossible as what happened in Bloomington." Amanda picked up another drawing. "Eleanor discovered something in Lab 7, didn't she? Something related to the research Thompson Technologies was conducting." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Your mother was never involved with the company's business. Not officially, but she and Margaret became friends. Eleanor started asking questions, investigating on her own." Amanda hesitated. "Elizabeth drew things only Eleanor could. Have seen, Dad. Conversations between her and Margaret, secret documents, experiments that should never have happened." A thunderclap shook the building, making the windows rattle. Richard stood up, walking to the window. Down below, the city continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the secrets threatening to surface. "Where are they, Amanda?" "Safe. Luke is..." Scared, confused. He was too young when it all happened, but he carries a deep hurt. "Elizabeth," Amanda sighed. "She's different. Stronger, more focused. She's determined to expose the truth no matter the cost." "I need to see them," Richard insisted. "There are things they need to know, things even you don't know. It's not that simple. Arthur Johnson is back in town." Richard froze. "How do you know that?" "Because he's also looking for the siblings, and unlike you, Dad, he doesn't seem to have good intentions." At that moment, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a recent photo. Arthur Johnson stepping out of a car in front of the old Lab 7, followed by men in suits. The message read, "Time is running out." "Amanda," Richard held his daughter's hands, "I need you to trust me. Take me to them. There's something I need to show Elizabeth, something Eleanor left in the winter garden." "What exactly?" "Proof that her mother didn't abandon us. She was trying to protect all of us." Richard pulled an old key from his pocket. "The day Eleanor disappeared, she left a letter. I never had the courage to open it, but now..." Amanda looked at her father for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "The siblings are at Grandma's old estate in Asheville. But Dad..." She hesitated. "Elizabeth has another drawing, one that shows what really happened to Eleanor and Margaret that night in Lab 7. Richard felt his heart tighten. "Then it's time we face the truth, all of us." As they left the building, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Arthur Johnson smiled, slipping his phone into his pocket. The game was just beginning, and he had his own plans for the Thompson family and the children of Margaret Smith. The property in Asheville remained almost exactly as Richard remembered it. The garden, once lovingly tended by his mother, was now a bit wild but still retained its natural beauty. As Amanda parked the car on the stone driveway, he noticed lights on inside the house. "They're waiting," Amanda said, turning off the engine. "Dad, I need you to promise to stay calm. Luke, he has a hard time controlling his emotions." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of Eleanor's letter in his pocket. The night air was thick with anticipation as they walked up to the porch. Before they could knock, the door opened. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her dark eyes studying Richard intently. "You took longer than we expected," she said, her calm voice contrasting with the tension of the moment. "Come in. Luke is in the living room." The interior of the house was different from his memories. Dozens of drawings covered the walls of the living room, forming a visual timeline that made Richard stop, stunned. They were moments from his life, from Eleanor's life, from Margaret's, all connected by invisible lines of fate and consequence. Luke was sitting on the old couch, his fingers nervously tapping on the armrest. Upon seeing Richard, the boy stood up abruptly. "What is he doing here?" "Luke," Elizabeth called softly, "we need to hear what he has to say." "Hear? Hear what?" Luke laughed bitterly. "More lies? More excuses?" Richard took a step forward, but Amanda held him by the arm. "Show them," she whispered. With trembling hands, Richard pulled the letter from his pocket. "Eleanor left this before she left. I never had the courage to open it." Elizabeth stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "I've seen this letter in my visions. Eleanor wrote it the night she found Margaret in Lab 7. "How could you know that?" asked Richard, his voice barely hiding his astonishment. The young woman touched one of the drawings on the wall. It showed Eleanor in her office, writing by the light of a lamp. "Because I see through their eyes. Eleanor, Margaret, their memories come to me through the drawings. It's a gift I've always had, but it intensified after that night." Luke moved closer to his sister, protective. "Show him, Liz. Show me what you saw." Elizabeth walked over to a folder on the table and pulled out a drawing Ricardo had never seen before. It depicted the interior of Lab 7, where Eleanor and Margaret were talking in an office. In Margaret's hands were documents bearing the Thompson Technologies logo. "Your wife discovered the truth about the experiments," Elizabeth explained. "Margaret had gathered evidence, but needed someone with influence to expose it all. Eleanor offered to help." "What experiments?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling. "Project Prometheus," Luke replied, his anger giving way to deep sorrow. "They were testing new technology in Bloomington, something that went terribly wrong." Richard sat down heavily, painful memories resurfacing. "Arthur. He oversaw the project. He assured us it was safe, that the tests were controlled." "Lies," Luke exploded. "Our mother tried to warn everyone, and when Eleanor decided to help her—" "Luke," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice firm. "Not yet." Richard looked at the letter in his hands, then at the young people in front of him. "Why did you bring me here? Why now?" Elizabeth picked up another drawing, this one showing Arthur Johnson in his office, speaking on the phone. "Because he's planning to restart Project Prometheus. And this time the consequences will be much worse." Amanda approached the drawings, studying them intently. "These documents in the drawings, are they real? Can we use them as evidence?" "No," replied Elizabeth. "The drawings are just windows into the past, but the real evidence—" She hesitated, glancing at Richard. "Eleanor hid them in the place where it all began." "The winter garden," murmured Richard, finally understanding. "The orchids. We need your help," said Elizabeth, her expression softening for the first time. "Not for revenge, but for justice, for all the families of Bloomington, and to stop Arthur from doing this again." Luke stepped closer to Amanda's father, his eyes brimming with tears. "Our mother trusted Eleanor, and Eleanor trusted you even in the end." Richard opened the letter with trembling hands, his heart racing as he recognized his wife's handwriting. The first words made his world stop. "My love, by the time you read..." This I will have already done what needed to be done. Please protect Marina's children. They are the key to everything. The Mendes mansion was silent when the group arrived, just after midnight. Richard guided Amanda, Elizabeth, and Luke through the dark hallways, each step echoing with the weight of recent revelations. Eleanor's letter had changed everything, turning suspicions into painful certainties. The winter garden is at the end of this hallway, explained Richard, his low voice reverberating in the silence. Eleanor would spend hours here tending to her orchids. She said they held secrets. Elizabeth stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the windows. Someone is watching us. Amanda rushed to the window but could only see their own reflections in the bulletproof glass. Luke approached his sister, holding her hand. What are you seeing, Bea? It's not a vision of the past, she murmured, furrowing her brow. It's different, like a shadow of what's yet to come. Richard typed a code into the panel beside the winter garden door. The room lit up softly, revealing dozens of orchids in various stages of bloom. The air was fragrant and humid, just as Eleanor liked it. Incredible, whispered Amanda, delicately touching one of the flowers. Mum always said orchids are like people. Each has its own personality. Elizabeth walked through the garden as if in a trance, her fingers lightly brushing the leaves of the plants. She stopped in front of a specific pot, her hands trembling slightly. Here. Eleanor hid something here. Richard approached, recognizing the orchid, a rare species Eleanor had brought back from one of her last trips. Carefully, he removed the pot from its stand. Inside the false bottom of the container, he found a flash drive protected in a waterproof casing. Eleanor thought of everything, he murmured, holding the device as if it was something precious. Luke, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Why didn't you look for it before? Why wait so long? Ricardo stared at the boy, seeing in him the same intensity that Margaret used to have. Because I was afraid of the truth, afraid to discover that I failed everyone, Eleanor, your mother, all of you. Fear is a prison we build for ourselves, Elizabeth said softly, her words carrying a wisdom beyond her years. She picked up her notebook and began to sketch quickly. But sometimes you have to face your fears to find freedom. The drawing took shape under her skilled fingers. It showed Arthur Johnson in his current office, hunched over blueprints and documents from Project Prometheus. Beside him, a computer screen displayed images from security cameras, the same cameras that were watching them at that moment in the conservatory. He knows we're here, Elizabeth said, her voice filled with urgency, and he's not alone. As if responding to her words, the lights in the conservatory flickered. The security system emitted a warning beep, and all the doors automatically locked. Dad? Amanda's voice trembled slightly. You're the only one who can control the security system, right? Ricardo was already at the control panel, typing frantic commands. Someone hacked the system, we're locked in. It's not just that, Elizabeth said, her eyes scanning the room. The air, it feels different. Luke started coughing, and soon the others felt it too, a sweet smell in the air, making their heads spin. Ricardo recognized the odor with horror. It was the same chemical compound used in the experiments of Project Prometheus. The ventilation system, he gasped, pulling his shirt over his nose. Arthur is using the conservatory as a testing chamber. Amanda ran to the windows, trying to break them without success. They're bulletproof. Elizabeth, still clutching her notebook, began to draw frantically, her strokes more urgent than ever. There has to be a way. Eleanor wouldn't let this happen. Suddenly, Luke shouted, "The orchids! Look at the orchids!" The flowers were changing color, reacting to the compound in the air. One in particular, near the ventilation system, had its petals turning a bright blue. "It's an indicator," murmured Richard, realization hitting him like a bolt of lightning. Eleanor wasn't just growing orchids, she was creating a warning system. Elizabeth finished her drawing. It showed Eleanor in her private lab developing a compound that, when in contact with certain chemicals, triggered a reaction in the orchids. In the corner of the paper, there was a sequence of numbers. "The emergency password," whispered Amanda, rushing to the control panel. "Quick, Dad, what are the numbers?" As Richard typed the sequence with trembling fingers, Elizabeth staggered, leaning on Luke. The air was growing heavier, and her visions more intense. "Eleanor," she murmured. "She's trying to show us something more." The panel emitted a confirmation beep, and the ventilation system shifted direction, beginning to purify the air. The doors unlocked with a soft click, but no one moved. On the security monitors, now reactivated, a lone figure watched everything. From their office across the city, their face twisted in a mask of fury. Richard's office in the mansion had turned into an impromptu operations center, while Amanda worked on her laptop, analyzing the contents of the flash drive found in the conservatory. Elizabeth covered an entire wall with new drawings, each revealing more pieces of the puzzle Eleanor had left behind. "This is much bigger than we imagined," said Amanda, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Project Prometheus wasn't just about alternative energy. They were developing something more, something that could alter the very structure of human consciousness." Luke, who had been sitting by the window watching the rain, turned abruptly. "How so?" Richard picked up an old folder from his desk. "The project started as research on sustainable energy. Arthur convinced the board that we could develop a self-sustaining form of energy, something revolutionary." He ran his hands over his face, exhausted. "But at some point, the research took a different turn." "The experiments in Bloomington," murmured Elizabeth, her fingers dancing over the paper as a new drawing took shape. "They weren't just energy tests. They were studying how the compound affected people." The drawing showed the interior of Lab 7, scientists in protective gear, observing through a glass pane, while volunteers performed seemingly simple tasks. In one corner of the paper, numbers and graphs indicated changes in brain waves. "Our mother discovered that the compound was causing side effects in the residents," said Luke, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Behavioral changes. Strange. Memories, visions." "Like yours, Elizabeth?" Amanda asked softly. The young woman stopped drawing, her eyes meeting Amanda's. "Margaret took me to the lab once when I was little. It was before she realized what was really happening. I think that's where it started." Richard approached the drawings on the wall, studying them with newfound understanding. Eleanor realized what was going on. That's why she started developing the modified orchids. They weren't just ornamental plants, they were living sensors. "And Arthur found out," Amanda added, opening a new file from the flash drive. "Look at this. Emails between him and a group called the Genesis Consortium. They didn't just want clean energy, they wanted control. Project Prometheus could give them the power to influence minds on a large scale." Elizabeth let out a small groan, her eyes closing as a new vision struck her. Luke rushed to support his sister, but she was already immersed in her creative trance, her fingers moving almost on their own across the paper. The new drawing showed Eleanor and Margaret in the private lab working together in secret. On the walls, complex chemical formulas intertwined with orchid schematics. And in one corner, partially visible, was a laptop with its screen displaying emails between Eleanor and a contact identified only as Guardian. "They weren't alone," whispered Elizabeth, opening her eyes. "There were others who knew, others who wanted to stop the project." Richard grabbed his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "It's about time." "Richard." "Professor Martinez." Richard took a deep breath. "I need to know the truth about the Guardian." Finally asking the right questions, the old scientist chuckled softly. "Meet me at the old university cafe in an hour. And Richard, bring Marina's children. It's time for them to meet the rest of the network." When Richard hung up, he found everyone staring at him. "Professor Martinez was my mentor in college," he explained, "and apparently he was part of something much bigger." "We can't trust anyone," protested Luke. "We've seen what happens when—" "We can trust him," interrupted Elizabeth, her eyes focused on a new drawing taking shape. In it, Professor Martinez appeared in a secret meeting with Eleanor and Margaret years ago. "He's been part of the resistance from the beginning." Amanda closed her notebook, determined. "Then that's it. We're finally going to find out what we're really up against." "And who is truly on our side," Ricardo added, looking at the young people fate had placed under his protection. As they prepared to leave, Beatrice made one last drawing. It showed the university cafe, where several people were gathered around a table. Their faces were deliberately shaded, except for one, Professor Martinez, who smiled as if guarding the greatest of secrets. "Whatever we're about to discover," she said, putting away her notebook, "it's going to change everything." The group left the mansion under the persistent rain, unaware of the drone watching them from afar, transmitting every movement to a dark room where Arthur Johnson observed, his cruel smile illuminated by the glow of the monitors. Beside him, a screen displayed the weather forecast for the coming hours. A storm was approaching Chicago. The Scholars Cafe remained almost identical to Ricardo's memories. The same black and white checkered floor, the same dark wooden tables, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the scent of old books from the university library next door. It was almost 2 a.m, but a soft light shone through the rain-fogged windows. Professor Martinez waited for them at a table, in the back, his sharp eyes observing every movement through his old tortoiseshell glasses. At 75, he still carried that aura of wisdom that had so inspired Ricardo in his student days. "You took your time," he said, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Time is a luxury we no longer have." Beatrice sat directly across from the professor, her eyes studying every detail of his face. Lucas remained standing, restless, while Amanda and Ricardo took the remaining seats. "So," Martinez began, pulling an old pocket watch from the table, "how much have you already uncovered about the true purpose of Project Prometheus?" "We know it wasn't just about alternative energy," Amanda replied. "They were experimenting with human consciousness." The professor smiled sadly. "Eleanor always said you had the same instincts as her for uncovering the truth." He opened the watch, revealing a hidden compartment with a microchip. "But this is just the surface." Beatrice picked up her notebook, automatically starting to draw. Martinez watched, fascinated, as the lines took shape on the paper. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "The compound truly affected you in a unique way, didn't it?" "How do you know about that?" asked Luke suspiciously. "Because I helped Eleanor develop the antidote," replied Martinez, pulling a yellowed envelope from his pocket. "Your mother wasn't alone, Luke. None of us were." Richard leaned forward. "The safety net. Who are they?" "Scientists, journalists, activists, people who discovered the truth about the Genesis Consortium and decided to fight back." Martinez opened the envelope, spreading old photos across the table. "It started decades ago, long before Project Prometheus. The consortium has always existed, just under different names, different faces." Elizabeth stopped drawing abruptly, her eyes fixed on one of the photos. It showed a group of people in front of a laboratory, including a young Eleanor next to Martinez. "You weren't just Richard's mentor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You were part of the resistance from the beginning." "And Eleanor joined us when she discovered what Arthur was really planning," Martinez confirmed. "She and Margaret formed a powerful alliance, one with access to the highest levels of Thompson technologies, the other with concrete evidence of the experiments." Amanda was typing furiously on her laptop. "The files on the flash drive. There are mentions of a protocol called Resurgence. What is it?" The professor took the microchip from his watch. "Eleanor's Last Hope, a program capable of reversing the effects of Project Prometheus and exposing the entire consortium operation. Why didn't they use it before?" "Why?" questioned Luke. "Because the price would be too high," replied Martinez, his eyes meeting Richard's. "The program would destroy not only Project Prometheus, but the entire infrastructure of Thompson Technologies." "Eleanor didn't want to ruin the life you built, Richard." Richard felt the weight of years of guilt and regret. "She should have told me." "She tried," interjected Elizabeth softly, a new sketch taking shape in her notebook. "The night she found Margaret in the lab." The drawing showed Eleanor in her office, phone in hand, tears in her eyes. On the paper in front of her, a partially written letter, the same one Richard had found in the winter garden. Arthur intercepted the call, Martinez continued, and then a thunderclap shook the windows of the Scholars Cafe, startling everyone. The lights flickered momentarily, and when they came back on, there was a new presence at the nearby table. "What a fascinating story," said Arthur Johnson, his cold smile illuminated by a flash of lightning. "But I'm afraid you've got a few details wrong." Martinez stood up quickly, but Arthur gestured, and several men emerged from the shadows of the cafe. "Don't be hasty, old friend. We still have much to discuss." "How did you find us?" asked Richard, instinctively positioning himself between Arthur and the younger ones. "Did you really think you were the only ones with access to advanced technology?" Arthur laughed, pulling a small device from his pocket. "Project Prometheus has evolved far beyond your primitive expectations." Elizabeth was trembling, her eyes wide. "The visions, they're different. Stronger." "Oh yes," Arthur smiled at her. "You are our greatest achievement, you know. The first true success of the project. And now we can finally complete what we started." "No!" Lucas shouted, but before anyone could react, thick smoke began to fill the cafe. Martinez acted quickly, pulling something from his pocket. "Elizabeth, the chip! Now!" In the chaos that followed, amid the smoke and the screams, Elizabeth saw through her visions what she needed to do. With surprising precision, she grabbed the microchip and hid it inside her sketchbook, just as the smoke became too dense to see anything. The torrential rain turned the streets of Chicago into rivers as the group ran through the dark alleys behind the university. Professor Martinez guided them through ancient passageways that even Richard didn't know, descending. Narrow staircases and crossing rusted gates. "This way," Martinez whispered, unlocking a heavy door that led to the basement of an abandoned building. "The old university tunnel system. Eleanor and I mapped out all the escape routes." Elizabeth clutched her sketchbook to her chest, feeling the weight of the microchip hidden between its pages. Lucas supported her, worried about the tremors still coursing through his sister's body. Amanda followed closely, constantly checking her phone for signs of pursuit. "How is she?" Richard asked Lucas, watching Elizabeth with concern. "The visions, they're different," the boy replied. "More intense. It's like what Arthur did at the cafe amplified something." Martinez led them through a maze of corridors until they reached a circular room filled with old laboratory equipment. He turned on a generator, and fluorescent lights flickered before stabilizing. "The first lab of Eleanor," he explained, moving quickly between the workbenches. "Before Thompson Technologies, before all of this, this is where we conducted the original research on sustainable energy." Elizabeth let out a small gasp, her eyes focusing on an empty spot in the lab. Her hands began to sketch frantically. "What are you seeing?" asked Amanda, stepping closer. "Eleanor, she's here. No, not here now, but before. She discovered something." The lines on the paper revealed Eleanor hunched over a microscope, making frantic notes. "The original project, it wasn't supposed to be like this." Martinez nodded gravely, rummaging through an old drawer. "Project Prometheus began as something beautiful, a form of energy that renewed itself naturally, inspired by DNA itself. But Arthur saw beyond. He realized that the same technology that could influence molecules could influence minds." Richard finished, the realization hitting him like a bolt of lightning. That's why he redirected the experiments to Bloomington. It wasn't just energy testing. "The entire population was his lab," Amanda said, her voice trembling with anger. "And when Margaret found out—" "She went to Eleanor," Elizabeth interrupted. A new drawing taking shape. It showed the two women in that same lab years later, hunched over documents and samples. They worked together in secret, developing a way to reverse the effects. Martinez finally found what he was looking for, an old metal box with the university's symbol. "The resurgence protocol isn't just a computer program, it's a cure." Eleanor managed to synthesize a compound that neutralizes the effects of Project Prometheus. "The orchids!" exclaimed Richard. "That's why she genetically modified them. They weren't just sensors, they were incubators," Martinez finished. "The antidote needed to be cultivated in a controlled environment, free from the influence of the original compound. Eleanor turned the winter garden into a secret lab." Luke, who was guarding the entrance, hurried back. "There's movement upstairs. Lots of footsteps." "Arthur," murmured Amanda. "He must have tracked the tunnel system." Elizabeth stood up abruptly, her eyes focused on something only she could see. "It's not just that." He brought the equipment from Lab 7. He's going to try to finish what he started. Martinez picked up the metal box and handed it to Richard. Inside are samples of the antidote and Eleanor's original notes. You need to get to the data processing center at Thompson Technologies. That's where the resurgence protocol must be activated. You're not coming? Asked Luke, worried. The old professor smiled sadly. Someone needs to delay them. Eleanor would do the same. No, protested Richard. We've already lost too many people. There's no time for arguments, Martinez said, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. In the faculty parking lot, Sector B3, there's a blue Volkswagen. This is the key. He separated an old key from the set. Inside the car there's a special laptop configured by Eleanor. Elizabeth will know how to use it. A distant explosion made the ceiling tremble. Dust fell over the old equipment. Go, ordered Martinez, pushing them toward a side door. And Richard, Eleanor always believed you would do the right thing when the time came. Don't let her down. As they ran through the dark tunnels, guided by the light of their phones, Elizabeth caught one last glimpse of the professor. In her notebook, she sketched Martinez standing in the lab, dignified and determined, as shadows approached from the stairs. But on his face was a smile of peace, the smile of someone finally fulfilling a promise made long ago. The data processing center of Thompson Technologies rose like a fortress of glass and steel against the stormy sky of Chicago. Inside the old Volkswagen parked 2 blocks from the building. The group made their final preparations. The laptop Martinez had mentioned was hidden under the back seat, protected by a special case. The security system was updated last week, explained Amanda, showing the building's blueprints on her phone. Even with your access, Dad, it won't be easy to reach the main server. Richard was watching the building through the rain-streaked windshield. Arthur must be waiting for us. He is, Elizabeth confirmed, her fingers dancing over a new page in her notebook. The drawing showed the interior of the data processing center, where dozens of armed men patrolled the halls. At the center of it all, Arthur was overseeing the installation of a strange device, connected directly to the main server. It's a modified version of the Lab 7 device, she explained, her eyes clouded by the vision. He plans to use Thompson Technologies infrastructure to amplify the signal. It won't just be Bloomington this time. It'll be the entire city, Luke finished, his voice trembling with anger. Maybe the whole country. Amanda opened the special laptop, and a unique interface materialized on the screen. The resurgence protocol. Did Eleanor program all of this? Richard stepped closer, recognizing his wife's coding style. She was always brilliant with codes, but this is different. It's as if she knew exactly what we'd face. She did, Elizabeth said softly. Her new drawing showed Eleanor working, on the laptop late at night in the winter garden. The orchids, they didn't just produce the antidote, some of them developed a form of limited precognition. Eleanor started having visions, like me. That's why she prepared all of this, Richard murmured, touching the screen with reverence. She saw what was coming. A thunderclap shook the car, and the lights of the data processing center flickered momentarily. Luke, who was watching through the back window, warned, "Movement at the main entrance, more guards arriving." Amanda kept studying the laptop. There's something strange here. The resurgence protocol is not just a destruction program. There's something more, intertwined in the code. Elizabeth closed her eyes, focusing. Her hands began to draw automatically, tracing lines of code that transformed into organic patterns, reminiscent of Eleanor's orchids. "It's a transformation program," she explained, her words coming out as if in a trance. "It won't just destroy. Project Prometheus. It will convert it into something new, something Eleanor and Margaret designed together." Richard picked up the metal box Martinez had handed him, opening it carefully. Inside, besides the antidote samples, there was a flash drive and a letter addressed to him. "Richard," he read aloud, recognizing Eleanor's handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means the time has finally come. What Arthur created can be transformed. Project Prometheus doesn't have to be an instrument of control. It can be a tool for liberation, for healing. But for that to happen, Someone needs to be at the epicenter when the protocol is activated. Someone with the antidote in their blood, capable of directing the transformation. Everyone looked at Elizabeth, who kept drawing, her strokes now revealing a complex network of connections between the server, Arthur's device, and the minds of the people. "It has to be you," said Luke, holding his sister's hand. "Your visions, your connection to all of this—" "No," protested Richard, "it's too dangerous. There must be another way." Elizabeth finally opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Richard's, with an intensity that painfully reminded him of Eleanor. "There is no other way, and you know it." Amanda, who was still analyzing the laptop, gasped. "There's one more thing, the protocol. It requires two people, one to initiate the transformation and another to anchor it, to keep it from becoming uncontrollable, like a human lightning rod," murmured Richard, finally understanding. He looked at the building, at the storm, at the young people fate had placed under his protection. "I'll do it." "Dad, no," pleaded Amanda. "It has to be this way," he said, with a sad smile. Eleanor knew. That's why she prepared all of this. She always knew I would need to make the right choice at the right moment. A new thunderclap lit up the sky, and for a moment, everyone could clearly see the device being raised atop the data processing center, a metallic tower pulsing with a bluish light, like a sinister beacon in the storm. "It's time," said Elizabeth, closing her notebook. On its last page, a drawing showed two figures atop the data processing center, engulfed in light, while waves of energy spread across the city. But unlike the previous visions, this one conveyed not fear but hope. "Let's finish what they started," said Richard, picking up the box with the antidote. "For Eleanor, for Margaret, for Professor Martinez, for everyone." The storm battered. Chicago, as Richard and Elizabeth emerged atop the data processing center. 40 floors above the ground, the wind howled around them, carrying promises of change. Arthur's device pulsed with a bluish energy, its antennas pointed skyward like accusatory fingers. "Too late!" Arthur's voice rang out through the storm. He stood beside his equipment, a triumphant smile on his face. "The process has already begun. In minutes, the entire city will be under the influence of Project Prometheus." "No," replied Elizabeth, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "It's not too late yet." She held her notebook in one hand, while the other clutched the vial containing the antidote. Richard stepped forward, shielding Elizabeth. "It's over." "Arthur, we know everything." "No!" Arthur laughed, the sound mingling with the thunder. "Do you know that Project Prometheus is the next stage of human evolution? That we can finally transcend our limitations?" "At the cost of people's freedom," Richard shot back. Eleanor and Margaret saw the truth. The project isn't about evolution, it's about control. On the ground floor, Amanda and Luke had managed to access the main control room. Through the monitors, they watched the scene unfold on the rooftop, while frantically working on Eleanor's special laptop. "The protocol is ready." Amanda communicated through the radio system, awaiting the signal. Arthur seemed to notice the laptop in Richard's hand for the first time. His eyes widened in recognition. The Resurgence Protocol. So Eleanor really completed it. "She did more than that," said Elizabeth, stepping forward. Her eyes began to glow with an inner light, and her hands instinctively moved to her notebook. "She showed us the way." A new drawing began to take shape on its pages, but this time it was different. The lines seemed to pulse with their own light, revealing an intricate network of connections spreading across the city, not to control but to liberate. "The true power of Project Prometheus," she continued, her voice taking on an ethereal quality, "is not in control, but in connection. Eleanor and Margaret discovered that. It's not about dominating minds, but uniting them in understanding." "Nonsense," shouted Arthur, but there was a hint of fear in his voice. "The project is mine. I created it." "So you created a prison," replied Richard, connecting the laptop to the system. Eleanor turned it into a bridge. Arthur's device pulsed more intensely, its bluish light tinting the clouds above. But something was changing. Where there had once been only the cold artificial glow, small points of golden light now began to appear. "Now, Amanda," Richard shouted over the radio. In the control center, Amanda and Luke initiated the resurgence protocol. Eleanor's laptop came to life, complex codes racing across the screen as the program integrated with the systems. Elizabeth staggered, feeling the energy flow through her. Richard steadied her, supporting her as she became the channel for the transformation Eleanor had foreseen. "No!" Arthur screamed, running toward his equipment. "You're going to ruin everything!" But it was too late. The antidote within Elizabeth, combined with her unique abilities, began to alter the very nature of the energy field. Where there had once been coercion, there was now harmony. Where there had been control, there was now choice. Richard, absorbing the excess energy as Eleanor had planned, felt something extraordinary. For a brief moment he could see through his wife's eyes. He finally understood the depth of her love, the extent of her sacrifice, and the beauty of her vision. Arthur's tower began to glow with a new light, golden and welcoming. Throughout Chicago, people paused for a moment, touched by a wave of understanding and empathy that transcended words. "This is how it should be," whispered Elizabeth, her drawings now showing not the past or the present, but possibilities. A future where technology and humanity coexisted in balance. Arthur, realizing his defeat, made one last desperate move toward the equipment, but Luke, who had climbed to the roof, intercepted him. "It's over," the boy said, not with anger, but with a serenity that surprised everyone. "My mom and Eleanor won, through us." Dawn found the city transformed, not dramatically or apocalyptically, but subtly, profoundly. Project Prometheus, redesigned by the Resurgence Protocol, became a network of connection and healing, exactly as Eleanor and Margaret had dreamed. Months later, the Winter Garden of the Thompson Mansion gained new residents. Elizabeth and Luke, now officially under Richard's guardianship, brought new life to the space. Eleanor's orchids continued to bloom, but they were now accompanied by Elizabeth's drawings, no longer visions of a painful past, but windows to a future full of possibilities. Amanda transformed Thompson Technologies, focusing on sustainable technologies and social impact projects. The legacy of Eleanor and Margaret lived on through a new generation of scientists committed to ethics and the common good. On a quiet afternoon, Elizabeth made her final drawing of the past. It showed Eleanor and Margaret in the Winter Garden years ago, planting the first modified orchids. On their faces were smiles of hope, the same hope that now blossomed in a new family, built not by blood but by love and the courage to do what was right. Richard, watching the sunset through the garden windows, finally found peace. The empire he had built had not crumbled. It had transformed into something greater, something more meaningful. And somewhere he knew Eleanor was smiling. "The future," said Elizabeth, showing her newest drawing a vision of infinite possibilities, "is what we make of it." And so, under the sky of Chicago, a new story began to be written, not with ink and paper, but with hope, courage, and the transformative power of love.